The night of the flickering sky began in silence, though silence was not unusual in that small corner of the world. What made it different was the way the stars seemed to hesitate, as if they too had forgotten their place. Some pulsed brighter than they should, while others dimmed and returned, blinking like the fragile breath of a candle. For a boy not yet old enough to understand the weight of wonder, it was simply strange, but not frightening. He sat at his window, chin resting on folded arms, eyes wide open even as the hour slipped into something meant for dreams. He remembered the way the air felt that night, heavy but soft, like a blanket that almost wished to lull him into sleep. The trees outside leaned with a rhythm that didn't belong to the wind, almost as though they were listening for a sound no one else could hear. And in that quiet, the boy, who would later be called Rick by everyone who mattered to him, made his first unspoken vow. He would not close his eyes until he knew why the stars were flickering. It was a promise made in the hushed innocence of childhood, but it would linger for years, stitched into his heart in ways he could never escape. Sometimes, when people think back on their earliest memories, they recall warmth, maybe the taste of soup or the soft echo of a lullaby. Rick's memory was different. What stayed with him was the pulse of those uncertain stars and the way he felt at once so small and yet somehow included in something vast. He had no words for it, but he felt chosen, as if the universe had leaned close enough for him to notice its breath. As the hours wore on, he began to count the stars that flickered most often. 1, 2, 3. He counted them twice, sometimes 3 times, afraid he might miss one, afraid they might vanish altogether if he dared to look away. In that quiet ritual, a pattern began to form, not in the sky, but inside him. He learned patience, the kind of patience that children rarely hold. He learned that watching closely was not the same as waiting, and that sometimes the act of simply noticing was enough to change how the night felt. His parents, asleep in their room, did not wake to see the flickering. Nor did the neighbors, wrapped in their own ordinary dreams. Only Rick carried that secret, one that made him feel oddly alone and yet comforted. To be the only witness was to carry both a burden and a gift. The boy pressed his palm against the cool window pane and whispered something he could never quite recall in the years that followed. Perhaps it was a question, perhaps it was a promise. All he knew was that the stars seemed to answer with a slow, steady shimmer that looked almost like understanding. And as the night deepened, the air grew softer still, lulling him towards sleep against his will. He fought it, blinking heavily, his head bobbing before snapping upright again. He wanted to stay awake just a little longer, just until the flickering made sense. But when at last his eyes slid shut, he drifted into a dream that felt like the continuation of what he had been watching. The stars followed him there, glowing in patterns that bent and curved like lines on a map he could not yet read. And somewhere, inside that dream, he heard a sound, low, humming and steady, like a lullaby meant for only him. When he awoke the next morning, the sky outside was bright and ordinary. Birds sang as though nothing had happened. His parents laughed softly in the kitchen, the smell of toast carrying through the air. For a moment, he almost believed the night had been nothing more than a child's wandering imagination. But then he noticed the notebook on his bedside table. He didn't remember putting it there, yet it was filled with clumsy sketches, shapes of stars, odd little lines that connected them, and circles drawn twice, as though he hadn't trusted his first attempt. The sight of it gave him a shiver that was not fear, but recognition. Rick carried the notebook to breakfast, clutching it like a fragile secret. He did not show his parents. He did not mention the flickering sky. Instead, he tucked it under his chair, as though hiding it would keep the mystery alive. For reasons he could not explain, he wanted the memory to remain his alone. Childhood is full of things too fragile to share, dreams that dissolve when spoken aloud, feelings that vanish when named. He chose to protect this one. That day, he walked to school as he always did, but he found himself glancing at the daylight sky more often than before, hoping for a flicker that never came. It was then, in those quiet steps between home and the world beyond, that he felt the first ache of paradox, an awareness that what is real can be fleeting, and what is fleeting can sometimes feel more real than anything else. He would not know, until years later, how deeply that single night would shape him, how the act of watching the stars, counting them twice and listening for answers, would guide the way he thought, the way he lived, the way he tried, again and again, to make sense of everything that never truly wanted to be understood. And, though he was only a boy, the paradox had already begun to settle in him like a seed. Something quiet, something waiting, something that would bloom in its own strange time. In the days that followed, the memory of the flickering sky refused to leave him. It stayed like a faint hum in the back of his thoughts, the way a melody sometimes lingers after the song itself has ended. Rick carried his notebook everywhere, tucked close to his side, though he never showed it to anyone. During lessons, he would open it quietly beneath his desk, tracing the lines he had drawn in the night, as though the act of retracing might reveal something he had missed. His teacher scolded him more than once for drifting off into the window, but Rick hardly cared. The daylight held no answers, yet he kept searching, certain the stars had left him with something more than just wonder. One afternoon, when the rest of the children spilled into the yard for games, Rick sat apart with his notebook balanced on his knees. He counted again, 1, 2, 3, 4. Each flickering star recorded carefully, though no one else had seen them. His classmate, a quiet girl with hair the color of ash, sat beside him without asking permission. She didn't speak at first. She simply watched his hand move, the pencil hesitating in small circles. When she finally spoke, it was only a whisper. "You draw like you're trying to remember a dream." Her words startled him, not because they were unkind, but because they felt true. He didn't answer, but for the first time he wondered if maybe he wasn't meant to carry the memory entirely alone. That night, long after his parents had gone to bed, Rick returned to his window. The stars shone steady, unwavering, as though they had never flickered at all. Yet even in their stillness, he could almost imagine them breathing. He tried whispering again, the way he had on that first strange night, asking questions he didn't know how to phrase. No answers came, but the quiet felt companionable, as if the sky itself was listening. Sometimes, not receiving an answer is its own kind of reply. He pressed his forehead to the glass, letting the cool surface ground him, and he thought of the girl's words, that he was drawing a dream. Perhaps that was all. This was. But then again, perhaps dreams were only the beginning of truths too vast to explain. In the weeks that followed, his world carried on with the small ordinariness of childhood. Schoolwork, laughter in the halls, the crunch of autumn leaves underfoot. But beneath it all, Rick began to notice details he had never paid attention to before. The way shadows lengthened differently depending on where you stood. How certain clouds drifted in patterns that repeated days later. He would pause in the middle of play just to trace the angle of a branch against the sky, memorizing how it shifted as the hours passed. It was as though the flickering stars had opened his eyes to something larger, something hidden in plain sight, waiting for anyone curious enough to watch. The girl, whose name was Emily, began to sit with him more often. She never pressed him for explanations, never asked what he was drawing. Instead, she shared her silence with him, a silence that felt like trust. They watched the playground together, though their gazes were never on the children running past, but on the sky above, on the way the light bent through the windows, on anything that whispered of patterns. Sometimes she would hum softly, a tune he didn't recognize, and he found himself sketching the rhythm in his notebook as though sound itself could be mapped like stars. One evening, as the sun fell low and painted the horizon in shades of copper, Rick walked home slower than usual. His notebook weighed heavily in his bag, filled with page after page of stars, circles, and lines. He stopped at the corner of his street and looked up, waiting. For a moment, just as the first stars appeared, he swore he saw one hesitate, just for a heartbeat, no more. It was enough. He felt the flicker like a secret handshake, a promise that the universe had not forgotten him. That night, he dreamt of a sky that was not above but around him, a vast ocean of light through which he drifted weightlessly. The stars flickered in careful patterns, and he realized with sudden clarity that they were trying to teach him something. Not words, not instructions, but a feeling, like a melody too deep to hum. He woke with the sound of it still thrumming. In his chest, the faint echo of a lullaby meant for no one else. He wrote the dream down before it could fade, each word shaky but urgent. Then he paused, staring at the half-finished page, and realized the flickering was no longer something he was simply watching. It had become part of him, stitched into his way of seeing. The paradox was already alive in his life. The stars seemed impossibly far, yet their light pressed close against his skin. They were both unreachable and intimate, a contradiction he carried like breath. And though he did not yet know it, the boy who once counted stars twice had begun the first quiet steps of a journey that would follow him far beyond childhood. For every flicker in the sky was mirrored in his own heart, reminding him that the smallest, strangest moments can grow into the roots of a life. The dream of the stars lingered with him longer than most dreams do. Even as days slipped into weeks, he felt it pulsing faintly beneath the surface of his ordinary life, like a secret rhythm guiding his steps. He could no longer look at the sky without expecting a flicker, no longer close his eyes without listening for that low, humming lullaby that had followed him into sleep. And though part of him wanted to tell someone, even Emily, about what he had seen and felt, another part held tightly to the silence. The silence seemed necessary, as though speaking too soon might cause the fragile mystery to scatter. At school, Emily began humming more often when she sat near him, and he noticed something curious. Her tunes shifted in ways that echoed his dreams. One evening, after returning home, Rick tried to hum back one of her melodies. It came out imperfect, halting, but there was a moment when the notes aligned so cleanly with the flicker in his memory that he felt his chest tighten with recognition. He wondered if she knew more than she let on, if perhaps she too had noticed things that others missed. But when he asked gently where she had learned the songs, she only shrugged and smiled, as though the question itself were beside the point. Life in his house carried on with the steady rhythm of parents who believed their child's world was ordinary, His father, with tired hands, worked late, and his mother hummed her own songs in the kitchen, songs of recipes and routines, songs meant to anchor rather than to dream. They didn't notice the notebook swelling with drawings or the restless way their son leaned into windows at night. Rick was grateful for their unawareness. It allowed him to carry his paradox without interruption. The more he watched, the more he wrote, the more he began to sense a pattern threading through his days, not only in the sky, but in the quiet spaces of the world around him. There were moments in the classroom when the clock's ticking seemed to skip, not in sound but in feeling, as though time had leaned sideways for a fraction of a breath. There were shadows that didn't seem to belong to the objects that cast them, faint and quickly forgotten, but enough to make him blink twice. Once, as he walked home through a stretch of trees, he could have sworn the wind stuttered, falling, silent in a way that left the branches frozen mid-sway. And then, with a blink, the world carried on as if nothing had happened. Each time, the paradox returned to him. Everything, both ordinary and extraordinary, steady yet untrustworthy, whole yet fractured. He began testing the world, though gently. At night, he would hold his breath and count until his chest ached, waiting to see if the stars responded. In class, he would stare at the second hand of the clock until the teacher called his name, hoping to catch it, lingering between marks. He wrote questions in his notebook, questions that never had answers. Why does stillness feel alive? Why do flickers feel like voices? The more he asked, the more he realized that his notebook was becoming less about recording and more about reaching, a hand extended towards something unseen. One evening, Emily noticed the notebook half open on his lap. She didn't touch it, but she looked at the pages long enough for him to feel exposed. Then she said quietly, "You're not just drawing dreams anymore, you're collecting them." Her words landed like a key in a lock he didn't know existed. He wanted to ask what she meant, how she could tell, but her gaze drifted to the horizon, where twilight was already softening into night. He followed her eyes and saw, just for a heartbeat, one star flicker faintly before returning to its steady glow. The moment passed quickly, but it was enough to confirm that he wasn't imagining everything. He turned to Emily, ready to speak, but her expression held the same mixture of wonder and restraint that he felt in himself. She wasn't afraid, and she wasn't surprised. She simply nodded, as though the sky had answered them both at once. That night, Rick lay awake longer than usual, notebook open beside him. He didn't draw the stars this time. Instead, he sketched the feeling, the warmth of recognition, the comfort of not being alone in what he carried. He drew lines that curved like echoes, as though one star could ripple into another, as though a flicker could travel through space the way a whisper travels through a room. And for the first time, he allowed himself to believe that maybe the flickering sky was not meant for him alone. As sleep finally crept over him, he thought of Emily's words, of the stars, of the quiet hum that threaded through his life. The paradox no longer felt like something to solve, but like something to grow into, something patient. He realized that mysteries do not always arrive to be answered. They sometimes arrive to be lived, and with that thought, he drifted into a dream where the flickering stars formed not maps, but pathways, soft trails of light winding forward into distances he could not yet name. The morning after that dream felt unusually quiet, as though the world itself was reluctant to disturb him. Rick carried the stillness with him as he walked to school, his notebook pressed firmly against his chest. The sky above was bright and ordinary, yet he could not look at it without imagining those hidden pathways of light waiting for him when the night returned. He felt changed, though he could not explain how, and in that quiet shift was the first real awareness that his life was no longer only his own. Something larger had begun to thread through it, soft and patient, like a hand, guiding him forward. Emily noticed immediately. She didn't need to ask. She had her own way of seeing. When she joined him at the schoolyard bench, she hummed a new tune, one that rose and fell gently like a tide. Rick listened, letting the melody settle into him, and then he nodded once. That was enough. Neither of them said anything more. Words would have been clumsy, too small for the truth they both felt. Instead, they shared the silence, letting it stretch comfortably between them like a blanket. Later that afternoon, during arithmetic, Rick caught himself staring at the classroom clock again. Its second hand seemed to hesitate, caught for just the smallest breath before ticking forward. He wondered if anyone else noticed, but the teacher droned on, the children scribbled in their books, and the world went on as if nothing unusual had happened. Only he sat there, heart quietly racing, feeling the ripple of the paradox brush against him once more. And when he turned his head slightly, he saw Emily watching him from across the room. She had noticed too. The recognition in her eyes was wordless but undeniable. That evening, as the two of them walked home together for the first time, Rick finally allowed himself to speak. "You see it too, don't you?" His voice was quiet, but in it was the weight of all the nights he had carried the flickering, alone. Emily didn't answer right away. She simply glanced up at the sky, still faintly glowing with the last stretch of sunset. Then she said softly, "Sometimes the world forgets to be ordinary." The words were simple, but they fit so perfectly into the space between them that Rick felt a strange comfort flood through him. She had seen, she had known, and she wasn't afraid. From that night on, they began a quiet ritual. They would meet at the edge of the field behind the school, where the grass grew long and the view of the sky was unobstructed. They would sit in silence, sometimes talking, sometimes not, waiting for the first star to appear. Often, nothing unusual happened. The stars shone steady and unremarkable, but occasionally, just occasionally, a flicker would break the pattern. When it did, neither of them gasped or pointed. They only sat closer, as though the small gesture of the sky was enough to bind them more tightly together. Rick's notebook grew heavier with each passing week, filled with sketches of constellations, fragments of Emily's melodies, questions without answers. He began to notice how the flickers did not feel random. They carried a rhythm, faint but certain, like footsteps fading into the distance. Sometimes he would copy the patterns over and over, circling the same stars, drawing lines that connected them in shapes that almost resembled words. He didn't know what it meant, but he felt that meaning was there, just beyond reach, waiting for him to grow into it. The seasons shifted gently. Leaves reddened and fell, the air grew cooler, and their field became a place of stillness wrapped in the scent of autumn. On one particular evening, the stars came early, sharp and clear in the crisp air. Rick and Emily sat side by side, their shoulders brushing. Without warning, a cluster of 3 stars flickered in sequence, one, then another, then the last, like a signal passed along an invisible wire. Rick drew in a breath, heart thudding, and before he could speak, Emily whispered, "It feels like they're talking." Her words echoed his own unspoken thought, and he felt the paradox deepen. The vast sky, unreachable, yet close enough to whisper into their very bones. He didn't sleep much that night. Instead, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the pattern of those 3 flickers. It felt deliberate. It felt alive. He wrote the sequence again and again in his notebook until the page blurred with circles and lines. And beneath it all, he felt a pull, not fear, not danger, but invitation. The kind of invitation that doesn't rush you, but waits with endless patience, knowing you will answer when you are ready. By morning, he was exhausted, but he carried the quiet certainty that his life was being shaped by something beyond childhood curiosities. The flickering had become more than a secret. It was a language, one he had only just begun to learn. And though he could not yet understand its words, he knew with complete certainty that it would follow him, shaping not just the boy he was, but the person he was becoming. As he walked to school, the paradox accompanied him like a shadow, both heavy and light, both question and comfort. He felt himself standing at the edge of something vast, not yet stepping forward, but knowing the ground beneath him would never again be the same. And in that awareness he smiled faintly, as if the sky had already whispered its quiet promise that this was only the beginning. The days that followed unfolded with a quiet rhythm, yet Rick felt as though he were walking within 2 worlds at once. One belonged to the ordinary, the lessons in the classroom, the sound of chalk against the board, the smell of wet earth after rain. The other was hidden, woven delicately through shadows and silences, marked by flickering stars and the gentle recognition he now shared with Emily. Every glance at the sky, every still moment when time seemed to pause, reminded him that the 2 worlds were not separate, but overlapped, layered like thin sheets of glass. He had begun to notice how even the simplest things seemed to hum with that same strange presence, as if life itself carried a pulse he had never paid attention to before. One evening, when the air was crisp and the wind carried the faint scent of wood smoke, Rick and Emily walked again to the field behind their school. The grass rustled softly around their ankles, and above them the first stars had just begun to appear. Rick's notebook was already heavy in his hand, but tonight felt different, almost ceremonial, as though the world was leaning closer to watch. They sat in their usual spot, shoulders brushing, and waited in silence. Minutes passed, then an hour, but the stars shone steady and unbroken. Emily hummed absently, her tune winding through the air like smoke, and Rick found himself restless. He wanted the flicker. He wanted proof that what they had seen before was real, not just a trick of tired eyes. He leaned back in the grass, staring upward until his neck ached, whispering under his breath words that felt both like questions and like prayers. And then, as if in answer, a single star pulsed faintly, dimmed, and returned. A flicker. Small, but undeniable. Rick sat upright, breath caught in his throat. He glanced at Emily, who had already stopped humming, her gaze fixed on the sky. They both saw it, the gentle blink of something vast and unreachable, leaning toward them for just a heartbeat. And then another star, a different one, flickered, in reply, almost as if the first had sent a message and the second had answered. Rick's notebook fell open in his lap as he scrambled to record it, his hand moving quickly across the page. Emily reached out, her hand resting on his arm to steady him. "Don't rush," she whispered, her voice soft but certain. "It will come again." And she was right. The flicker returned, a pattern of 3 this time, slow and deliberate. 1. Pause. 2. Longer pause. 3. Rick's pencil hesitated as he tried to capture not just the placement of the stars, but the timing, the rhythm, the way it felt like a lullaby drawn out into the night. When the sequence ended, the sky settled into steadiness again, as though nothing had ever happened. The field was quiet except for the rustling grass and the sound of their breathing. Rick pressed the notebook to his chest, his heart pounding. He had never felt so close to something he could not explain. The paradox grew deeper. An impossible distance wrapped in intimacy, the unreachable sky speaking in a language only silence could hold. Emily leaned back on her elbows, her face tilted upward. "It isn't just for you," she said softly, almost to herself. "It's for anyone willing to listen." Her words unsettled him at first. Until then, he had thought of the flicker as something private, a secret chosen only for him. But as he watched her in the starlight, the truth of it sank in. The universe was not a single voice whispering into his ear. It was a vast chorus, and he was only beginning to learn how to hear it. That night, as they walked home in silence, Rick felt both heavier and lighter. He was not alone, not truly, but with that realization came a new weight of responsibility. If the flicker could be seen by more than one pair of eyes, then perhaps it carried meaning beyond what he could write or draw. Perhaps it was a gift meant not to be owned, but to be shared carefully, reverently, like a story told in hushed tones before sleep. When he finally lay in bed, sleep slow to come, he thought again of the sequence, the rhythm of three, the pauses between, the deliberate feel of it. He traced it in the air with his finger, letting the movement lull him, the memory of the flickers blending into the hum he had carried from his dreams. And as his eyes drifted closed, he understood something he had never considered before. The stars were not simply speaking, nor were they only singing. They were teaching, not with answers, but with patterns, not with explanations, but with echoes that asked him to look closer, to listen longer, to wait with patience. In that awareness, he drifted into sleep, the paradox a steady companion at his side. The stars outside his window shone still and constant, but in his dreams they danced once more, their flickers weaving into pathways that curved forward into a future he could not yet imagine. And though he did not know what awaited him, he felt ready, or at least willing, to follow. Morning sunlight crept through the curtains, soft and pale, as Rick woke with the remnants of the night still clinging to him. The rhythm of three flickers played in his mind like a pulse, echoing with the weight of significance. He sat on the edge of his bed, notebook open on his lap, staring at the sketches he had made in the field. Each star was marked carefully, the pauses noted in shaky lines, but the meaning remained just beyond his grasp. He traced the symbols again and again with his finger, as though repetition might reveal something hidden beneath the surface. Yet, the silence of his room offered no clarity, only the steady tick of the clock and the hum of a world that did not know what he carried inside. At school, the ordinary rhythm felt strangely distant. The chatter of students, the scrape of chairs, the monotone of lessons all seemed muted, as though he were hearing them from behind a glass wall. Emily noticed, of course. She always did. When the bell rang for lunch, she found him beneath the old oak tree outside, notebook still in hand. She sat beside him without asking and leaned close enough to glimpse the page. "You've written it down 100 times, she murmured, her voice careful. "But maybe it isn't just about what you see. Maybe it's about how you feel when you see it?" Rick frowned, his pencil frozen mid-sketch. He had been so focused on capturing the stars with precision that he had not considered the possibility of emotion being part of the pattern. He remembered the way his chest had tightened with the flicker, the strange calm that followed, the quiet certainty that lingered even now. Maybe she was right. Maybe the stars weren't sending information like numbers or letters, but something more fragile, more human. That thought stayed with him for the rest of the day, weaving itself into every corner of his mind. By evening, when the sun slipped low and shadows stretched across the town, he knew he couldn't wait. He needed to see the sky again, to test this new understanding. Emily was waiting when he arrived at the field, her scarf pulled tight against the cool air, her eyes shining in the fading light. Neither of them spoke as they settled onto the grass. Silence felt necessary, a kind of respect for what might come. The stars bloomed above them slowly, like flowers opening in the dark. Rick watched with a mixture of longing and fear, his body tense with anticipation. The minutes stretched, heavy and uncertain, until there. A flicker, faint but sure. One, then a pause, another. Then the rhythm of three again, steady as a heartbeat. Rick's breath caught, but this time he didn't write. He simply closed his eyes and let the feeling sink into him. The flicker did not speak in words. It did not explain or answer. Instead, it wrapped around him like warmth, a reassurance he couldn't name. For a moment, he thought he felt the earth itself beneath him hum in agreement, as if the stars above and the ground below were connected in a way he had never noticed before. The paradox returned, sharp and gentle, impossible and undeniable. Distant light made intimate, unreachable silence that somehow touched him. Emily's hand found his in the dark, her grip steady, grounding him. "Do you feel it?" she whispered. He nodded, eyes still closed. "It's not just what they're showing, it's what they're giving." When he opened his eyes, the flicker had gone, the sky once again ordinary. But something inside him had shifted. He no longer felt like an observer taking notes from the edge of the mystery. He felt like a participant, a listener invited into a conversation that stretched across time and space. On the walk home, Emily spoke carefully, as if her words might disturb the fragile thread still hanging between them. "If this is real, and I think it is, then it won't stop here. It will grow. Patterns always do." Rick held her words close. He didn't know what shape the growth would take, but he sensed she was right. The flicker was not an end. It was a beginning, a doorway, just slightly ajar. And he, with his notebook and his restless curiosity, had already stepped through. That night, he lay awake long after the house had fallen silent. The stars outside his window were steady, unremarkable, yet his chest still carried the echo of their rhythm. He thought of the way the pattern had filled him, how it had felt less like learning something new and more like remembering something long forgotten. It was as though the universe had always been speaking, but only now had he grown quiet enough to hear. Sleep came slowly, wrapped in a sense of both wonder and unease. For if the stars were teaching, then surely there was more to come. Lessons, yet unseen, meanings yet uncovered. And though he could not know where this path would lead, Rick understood that he had crossed a line that could never be retraced. The flicker was no longer a secret curiosity. It was a summons, and he would not turn away. The following days carried a quiet weight, as if every ordinary moment hid something extraordinary beneath its surface. Rick found himself moving through routines with half of his mind elsewhere, listening for echoes of the rhythm that had etched itself into his chest. In class, the teacher's voice blurred into background noise while he sketched tiny constellations in the margins of his notebook. At home, the clatter of dinner and his parents. Gentle questions felt like distant ripples compared to the stillness he now carried inside. Emily noticed, of course. Her steady gaze caught him whenever he drifted too far, pulling him back with a word or a smile. Yet she didn't scold or push. She seemed to understand that what he was carrying was too delicate to be named too quickly. One evening, unable to contain the pull any longer, Rick slipped outside after the town had quieted, his notebook pressed against his side. The night air was cool, laced with the faint scent of damp grass, and the sky above stretched vast and patient. He walked farther than usual, past the familiar field, past the worn path that led to the oak. Something urged him onward, as if the rhythm itself was guiding his steps. He stopped only when he reached the edge of a small rise overlooking the valley, a place he had never stood before. From here, the horizon seemed to tilt, and the stars opened wider, more unguarded. He sat down on the cool earth and waited, heart steady but expectant. At first, the sky was silent, only the slow drift of familiar constellations. But then, almost shyly, a flicker appeared. One, then another, then three, in the rhythm he knew so well. His chest tightened, but before he could lose himself in the pattern, something new stirred. A pause. A silence heavier than before. And then, not three, but four flickers, breaking the rhythm in a way that startled him. He leaned forward, eyes wide, notebook trembling in his hands. The shift was small, but it felt immense. The universe had changed the conversation, nudged him deeper. He scribbled furiously, but even as the pencil scratched across the page, he realized the numbers weren't enough. Four flickers carried a different feeling, a deeper resonance that words failed to catch. It was not a correction, but a layering, as if the stars were saying, "You've heard the beginning, now hear more." Emily's voice startled him in the quiet. "You came here without me." He turned to see her climbing the rise, her breath visible in the night air. She sank beside him, no reproach in her tone, only curiosity. "And? Did they speak again?" Rick hesitated, then nodded. "It's different now, not just three. There's four. I don't know what it means, but it feels like a step forward, like they're waiting for me to notice." She leaned closer, peering at his notes. "It's not about the numbers. It never was. It's about what changes when you're paying attention." Her words landed with quiet certainty, and Rick felt a shiver run through him. The stars were not just performing some cosmic trick for him to decode. They were alive in their silence, teaching through presence, shaping his awareness as much as his understanding. The paradox returned, sharper now, the vast, unreachable stars shaping something tender and personal inside him. As they sat together, the flickers continued, irregular now, unpredictable. Sometimes three, sometimes four, sometimes none at all. Rick stopped writing, letting the notebook rest against his knee. Instead, he listened, not just with his eyes or his mind, but with something deeper. The silence between flickers hummed with meaning, and for the first time he felt less like an observer of the stars and more like a part of them, drawn into their slow and patient rhythm. When the sky finally stilled, leaving only ordinary starlight, Rick and Emily walked home in silence. The air was cool and gentle, and the world around them seemed to exhale. At his door, she touched his arm lightly. "Don't rush it," she said softly. "Some things only reveal themselves when you wait." That night, lying awake again, Rick thought of her words, of the pause between 3 and 4, of the way the stars had shifted as though testing him. He felt the stirrings of something larger, something that wasn't just about him, or the flickers, or even the sky. It was about listening, truly listening, to what the world was always offering, in patterns too soft to notice until you stopped to feel them. And as his eyes drifted shut, he wondered, not with fear but with awe, what the stars might ask of him next. The following morning felt strangely heavier, as though the air itself remembered the night before. Rick moved through his house in silence, the scrape of utensils at breakfast and the faint hum of the television fading into a blur he couldn't quite hold on to. His parents chatted softly, unaware of the shift that had taken root in him. Al kept thinking of the fourth flicker, the sudden break in rhythm, the way it had opened something inside him he didn't know existed. It was a quiet weight, not frightening but undeniable, as though a thread had been tied from the stars straight into his chest. At school, the day unfolded as it always did, but every ordinary moment felt layered with something unseen. The scrape of chalk on the blackboard reminded him of the pauses between flickers. The hush before a question was answered in class carried the same kind of fullness as the silence between 3 and 4. Emily caught his distant look more than once, and each time her steady gaze pulled him back without words. It was becoming their language, her presence grounding him when he drifted too close to the edge of thought. By the time the final bell rang, the weight of the day had built to a quiet urgency. Rick lingered near the oak tree where they usually met, his notebook pressed against him. When Emily arrived, her scarf fluttering in the cool breeze, she tilted her head and asked softly, "You're thinking about going back tonight, aren't you?" He nodded. "It's different now. I can't stop wondering what comes after 4. She didn't argue or ask him to wait. Instead, she smiled faintly, though there was a shadow in her eyes. "Then we go together." That evening, the field welcomed them with its familiar quiet. The grass whispered in the wind, and the air smelled, faintly, of earth and smoke from far-off chimneys. They climbed the rise again, the place where the stars had broken their pattern and settled into the cool ground. The sky stretched wide above them, patient and watchful, and Rick felt his heart beat in rhythm with the silence, waiting for the flickers to return. When they did, it was not in the pattern he expected. First came 3, steady as always. Then a long pause that stretched so far he almost thought the stars had gone silent for good. Just as his chest tightened with doubt, 5 flickers shimmered in quick succession, sharp, bright, undeniable. His breath caught. He turned to Emily, but she was already staring at the sky, her face lit with awe. Neither of them spoke. The shift was too large, too profound for words. 5 carried a different energy altogether, not just an extension of 3 or 4, but something new, something layered with gravity. It felt less like an answer and more like an invitation, as though the stars had tested his patience, his willingness to listen, and now offered a doorway into something deeper. Rick's hand trembled as he reached for his notebook, but Emily gently placed her hand on his wrist, stopping him. "Don't write it," she whispered. "Just feel it." So he did. He closed his eyes and let the rhythm wash through him. The flickers seemed to hum inside his chest, vibrating with meaning that words could never hold. He felt small, impossibly small, yet somehow part of something infinite, like a single note in a song that stretched across galaxies. The paradox deepened. Distance that felt intimate, silence that spoke louder than words. When at last the sky steadied, the ordinary stars twinkling as though nothing had happened, Rick opened his eyes to find Emily watching him. Her expression was tender, almost protective. "You're changing," she said softly. "Do you mean that in a good way?" he asked, his voice unsteady. "I mean it in a true way," she replied, and her words lingered like an echo. On the walk home, Rick felt both exhilarated and unsettled. The numbers no longer felt like mere counts. They carried moods, tones, emotions. 3 had been a beginning, 4 a shift, 5 a calling. He wondered what lay ahead, whether the stars would keep building, and if he would ever be able to carry the weight of what they were showing him. That night, lying in his bed, the darkness of his room felt alive, as if the flickers still pulsed somewhere beyond the walls. His thoughts circled endlessly, caught between wonder and unease. He realized that this was no longer just a secret curiosity to share with Emily. It was becoming something larger, something that demanded more of him than simple observation. Sleep came slowly, pulling him under, with images of light dancing across the sky. In his dreams, the flickers moved not as numbers but as waves, flowing in and out, carrying him with them. And even in the depths of sleep, he sensed a truth blooming quietly inside him. The stars were not only teaching him, they were shaping him. And he was no longer the same boy who had first stared at the sky and wondered if the universe could notice someone like him. The next morning carried with it a strange stillness, as though the world itself was hesitant to disturb the quiet transformation that had begun. Rick moved through his routine in silence, spooning cereal into a bowl he didn't taste, staring out the window at a sky too pale and ordinary to hold the memory of flickers. His parents' voices floated around him, steady and familiar, but they seemed impossibly far away, like echoes from a life that no longer fit him the same way. He wondered if they could see it, the quiet shift inside him, the way his chest carried something that didn't belong to this small town or this simple morning. But they only smiled at him as though nothing had changed, and perhaps that was part of the paradox too. The stars could alter everything within him, yet the world outside carried on untouched. At school, the days blurred into a kind of dream. Teachers spoke, chalk scratched against the board, students whispered and laughed, but Rick felt as though he was watching it all through glass. The flickers lingered in the back of his mind, pressing against him like a soft weight he couldn't set down. He tried to act normal, to laugh when others laughed, but Emily saw through it. She always did. Between classes, she caught his arm and leaned close enough that her words were only for him. "You're not here anymore," she said quietly. "You're halfway between the classroom and the stars." Rick lowered his eyes. "I don't know how to be both." She studied him for a moment, then offered a small, patient smile. "Maybe you're not supposed to choose. Maybe you're supposed to learn how to carry them together." Her words sank into him, settling like stones at the bottom of a river. He thought about them for the rest of the day, and by evening, he knew he needed to see the stars again, not out of impatience, but because the longing was too deep to ignore. When he told Emily, she didn't hesitate. Together they walked the familiar path, their footsteps quiet against the earth, until they reached the rise where everything had begun to change. The night sky opened above them, vast and endless, yet somehow waiting. They lay side by side, shoulders brushing, and the silence between them felt just as important as the space between stars. Rick's breath slowed, his heart falling into rhythm with the stillness. He didn't ask for the flickers to come. He only waited as though patience itself was part of the lesson. When the first flicker arrived, it was faint, almost hesitant, but unmistakable. 3 as before. Then a pause, long and deliberate. 4. Then silence, so deep it seemed to press against their skin. Just when Rick began to wonder if that was all, 5 blazed again, bright, sharp, undeniable. His chest tightened, but this time there was more. After 5, a final flicker glimmered faintly, a 6th almost hidden, as though testing whether he was paying attention. Rick gasped softly. Emily's hand tightened around his, her breath catching in the dark. Neither of them moved. The sky was speaking again, and the change felt monumental, a slow unfolding of something that stretched beyond numbers. 6 carried a different kind of weight, not just an addition, but an expansion, a widening of the doorway. It felt less like a sequence and more like a progression, as though the universe itself was walking with them, step by step, deeper into its mystery. Rick's heart beat fast, but instead of writing, he simply closed his eyes. He let the 6 sink into him, not as a number but as a feeling. It was steady, grounding, like the breath he hadn't realized he was holding. It whispered of balance, of something greater than the flickers themselves, something that reached into the space between their silence and his own. When the sky finally calmed, returning to its quiet shimmer, Rick opened his eyes slowly. Emily was still holding his hand, her gaze fixed on him, not the stars. "It's changing you," she whispered. "Every night, a little more. I don't think you even see it." He swallowed, unsure of how to answer. She wasn't wrong. Each flicker carried more than light. It carried responsibility, a sense of being trusted with something fragile and infinite. It scared him, but it also filled him with a wonder so deep he couldn't imagine turning away. On the walk home, neither spoke much. The silence between them was not emptiness, but fullness, alive with everything they had seen and felt. Rick glanced at Emily once, noticing the way her face softened in the moonlight, and realized he wasn't alone in this. Whatever the stars were teaching, she was part of it too. That night, lying in bed, Rick felt the echo of 6 flickers ripple through him like a tide. He didn't know what it meant or where it would lead, but he sensed that he was no longer simply a boy staring at the sky. He was becoming part of something larger, something that reached beyond his small town, beyond his life, maybe even beyond himself. And with that thought, he drifted into sleep, the rhythm of the stars still pulsing softly in his chest. Morning light spilled across Rick's room, pale and soft, but he woke with the echo of 6 still pressing against his chest like a hidden drumbeat. It was different this time. 3 had been a beginning, 4 a shift, 5 a call, but 6 felt like a turning point. He lay still beneath his blanket, staring at the ceiling, wondering why the number clung to him so insistently. It wasn't just light anymore, not just a pattern. It felt like a step into a place where the stars were no longer distant ornaments, but participants, guiding him deeper into something he could neither name nor resist. At school, he caught himself, drifting again, tracing invisible flickers on his desk with the tip of his finger. His teacher's words slid past him like water, leaving no mark, but Emily's eyes found him more than once. She didn't scold. She only watched with a kind of patient sadness, as though she knew he was walking a road that could not be unwalked. When the bell finally released them into the fading afternoon, she walked beside him in silence until they reached the oak tree, its branches swaying gently in the breeze. "You're carrying it with you," she said softly, her gaze steady. Rick nodded. It doesn't leave me anymore. Even when I try to stop thinking about it, it's still there, like it's waiting. Maybe it is, she replied. Maybe you're being asked to listen in a way no one else has. Her words stayed with him as the day slipped into evening. By the time the sky began to darken, he knew he couldn't stay inside. The flickers weren't just something to witness now. They felt like a conversation unfinished. Emily joined him without question, and together they made their way to the rise, the familiar path marked by quiet anticipation. The night opened wide, and they lay side by side once more, the earth cool beneath them. Rick felt his heartbeat slow, falling into rhythm with the waiting sky. Minutes stretched, thick and quiet, until at last the stars stirred. First 3, steady and certain. Then 4, slower this time, as if deliberate. A pause, longer than he remembered, filled with a weight that pressed on his chest. Then 5, sharp and insistent, followed by 6, clear, undeniable, as though reminding him that what he carried was real. But then, after a silence that seemed to stretch forever, something new happened. The flickers returned not as a count, but as a wave, 3 quick bursts, followed by a hush, then 2 more, softer, almost hidden. Rick's breath caught. It was no longer a simple sequence. It was a pattern bending, reshaping itself, whispering of something beyond numbers. Emily squeezed his hand, her eyes wide. "Did you see that?" He nodded, his throat dry. "It's changing again. It's not just counting anymore." The air felt different around them, charged with something invisible. Rick closed his eyes, letting the rhythm sink into him, not as digits but as music, a phrase half-sung, unfinished. The paradox deepened, cosmic silence that felt like song, immeasurable distance that felt closer than his own breath. It left him shaken, not with fear, but with awe so large it almost hurt. When the flickers finally stilled, the stars returned to their quiet watchfulness, as though nothing had happened. Rick sat up slowly, the grass cool against his palms. "It's more than I thought," he whispered. "It's not just teaching, it's shaping. Like it knows I'm listening and it's adjusting." Emily studied him, her expression caught between wonder and worry. "And what if it keeps going? What if it asks something of you that you can't give?" Her question lingered long after the walk home, echoing in his thoughts as he lay in bed. He couldn't shake the sense that she was right. The stars weren't just flickering for him to admire. They were leading him somewhere, testing him step by step, waiting to see how far he was willing to go. Sleep came slowly, tangled with dreams of light shifting like tides, pulling him deeper into their rhythm. In the dream, he reached out to touch the stars, and they bent toward him, folding distance into closeness, silence into meaning. And even as he woke in the grey hush of dawn, the sensation clung to him, the feeling that the universe was no longer something he looked at from the outside, but something reaching back, choosing him, one flicker at a time. The following morning felt heavier in a way Rick could not name, as though the night had left an imprint deeper than memory. He moved through his house with quiet steps, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant chatter of his parents, the soft creak of the floorboards. All of it seemed filtered through a gauze of something infinite. His chest still carried the echo of 6, and the strange new pattern from last night pulsed faintly in his mind like a tide brushing against the shore. It wasn't urgency he felt, but a magnetic pull toward the unseen, a beckoning that demanded both patience and attention. At school, the ordinary world blurred beneath this undercurrent. The classroom felt smaller, as if the walls leaned inward, pressing him closer to the thoughts he could not contain. Emily's presence beside him was steady and quiet. She didn't need to speak. Her glance, the brush of her shoulder, the way she hummed a note beneath her breath, all of it reminded him he was not alone in this strange attunement. Between lessons, she tugged him aside, whispering, "Don't lose yourself in the counting. Feel the rhythm instead." Rick tried. He really did. But as the day stretched forward, every mundane sound, the scratch of pencil on paper, the rustle of pages, the hum of conversation, echoed differently, caught between ordinary and infinite. He scribbled diagrams in the margins of his notebook, attempts to map not just the flickers, but the spaces between them, the pauses that seemed as meaningful as the light itself. Nothing captured it, and yet, in the very act of trying, he felt himself learning, absorbing, becoming something slightly altered, stretched by an unseen force. By evening, he could not stay inside. Emily waited as always, calm and patient, her scarf brushing the wind. Together, they walked beyond the familiar rise, taking the path that twisted through the field toward a higher vantage point he had discovered over the past nights. The sky above opened wide, vast and expectant, as if it too had been waiting for them. They lay on the grass, shoulders touching, and watched the heavens unfold. At first, the stars were steady, unremarkable. Then the rhythm began. 3, steady. 4, deliberate. A pause long enough to feel infinite. 5, insistent. 6, soft but clear. And then, the unexpected. 7 flickers moving with a fluidity he had never seen, shifting, merging, fading, like a language not meant to be understood, but felt. Rick's hand hovered over his notebook, but he did not write. He could only absorb the sensation, letting it flow through him, a vibration in his chest that spoke more of presence than of meaning. Emily tightened her hold on his hand. "It's more than numbers now," she whispered, reverence in her voice. "It's the rhythm of everything. It wants you to notice, to exist inside it." Rick nodded, swallowing the awe in his throat. He had begun to understand that these flickers were not puzzles, but invitations. Invitations to patience, to listening, to surrendering to something larger than comprehension. Each night, the rhythm shifted slightly, bending, growing, testing him not for mastery, but for awareness. 7 had felt like a leap, a quiet nudge beyond the limits of expectation, a call to participate fully rather than merely observe. When the sky finally stilled, the ordinary stars once again taking their quiet watch, Rick and Emily lay in silence, absorbing the weight of what had passed. They didn't speak, not immediately. The enormity of 7, the way it reshaped everything they had thought they knew, settled gently over them, a shared secret held in quiet reverence. The walk home was unhurried, their steps matching the slow pulse of thought that lingered in Rick's mind. Emily spoke softly only once. "Some things don't ask for understanding. They ask for trust." He carried her words into the house, letting them mingle with the memory of the night. Even in bed, sleep came slowly, threaded with flickers, patterns and rhythms that pulsed through his chest like a quiet heartbeat. He dreamed of the stars bending close, not as distant lights, but as companions teaching him a way of listening he had never known. And though he could not yet name what lay ahead, he sensed that each step, each flicker, was preparing him for a horizon he had only begun to glimpse a horizon where the ordinary and the infinite could coexist in quiet harmony. The morning after, the night of 7 flickers, Rick woke with a sense of quiet tension threading through him, as if the stars had left an invisible imprint that would not fade. The light through his window was soft, spilling across the room in pale, hesitant strips, and he lay for a moment tracing the faint shadows on the ceiling, feeling the rhythm of the flickers still pulsing inside. Breakfast was quiet. His parents chatted gently, unaware that he was carrying something immense in the hollow spaces between his ribs. He didn't attempt to speak of it. They wouldn't understand. Not yet. At school, he moved like a ghost, physically present, but inwardly tethered to the sky. Every sound, the scrape of chalk, the murmur of students, the soft shuffle of feet on linoleum, felt magnified, carrying a resonance that reminded him of the pauses between flickers. Emily's presence beside him was a grounding force, her quiet observation a tether, pulling him back whenever he drifted too far. She didn't need to speak. She only offered the occasional touch, a brush of her hand, a look heavy with understanding. By afternoon, Rick realized that waiting had become its own lesson. He carried his notebook but barely touched the pencil, sensing that writing might constrain what the stars were now trying to teach. He and Emily didn't speak of the patterns, yet their shared silence was rich with meaning. Each glance, each small gesture, each quiet inhale carried layers of comprehension they could not yet voice. As twilight fell, they walked toward the rise, the path familiar yet new under the soft, dimming sky. Grass whispered beneath their steps, carrying the faint scent of earth and late blooming flowers. The world felt both ordinary and impossibly vast, as if the night itself had stretched wider in anticipation of what was to come. They lay side by side, shoulders touching, listening to the world exhale around them, waiting for the rhythm to arrive. And arrive it did, though differently this time. 3 flickers began, steady and confident. 4 followed, deliberate and patient. 5, insistent, then 6, soft and deliberate. 7 arrived, bending with a subtle fluidity, almost teasing, a reminder that the patterns were not static. But then a new pulse emerged. Not 8, not 9, but a wave, gentle, undulating, almost musical, like the stars had begun speaking in phrases rather than counts. Rick's breath caught in his throat. He reached instinctively for his notebook, but paused, letting the movement of light ripple through him without interference. Emily's hand found his, grounding him. "It's speaking now," she whispered, voice soft and reverent. "Not numbers, not rules. It's feelings, presence." Rick closed his eyes and let the rhythm wash over him. Each flicker, each pause, carried layers beyond comprehension, embedding itself in his chest like a quiet heartbeat. It was as though the universe itself was teaching him a new way to exist, not through observation, not through analysis, but through immersion. The paradox he had felt since the first flicker deepened, distance that drew him in, silence that spoke more than words, and an intimacy that stretched across the vast night sky. The stars stilled at last, leaving only ordinary twinkling light, yet the room within Rick's mind vibrated with their echo. He turned to Emily, her face serene in the pale light of the rising moon. "It's alive," he whispered, uncertain how else to describe it. She nodded slowly, as if confirming what he already felt. "And it's learning you too. That's why it changes. That's why it waits. You're not just watching, you're part of it. Now." They walked home in a thoughtful silence, each step echoing with the quiet weight of shared understanding. Rick felt a subtle shift within himself, a sense of expansion he could not articulate, only feel. Sleep. Later that night came wrapped in currents of light and warmth, the flickers moving like gentle waves across his consciousness. In dreams, they reached toward him, but instead of distant, they felt close, inviting, tender, patient, even. Upon waking, the rhythm remained, a faint hum threading through his chest. He realized that the stars were no longer merely a curiosity or a puzzle. They were a living conversation, one that demanded presence, attention, and trust. And with that understanding, he felt both exhilarated and humbled, knowing the journey was only beginning, and that each night, each flicker, each pause would shape him further into someone who could exist simultaneously in the ordinary world and the vast, whispering expanse beyond. That evening, as the sun dipped low behind the distant hills, Rick felt a pull he could not name, a gentle insistence tugging him toward the rise. The day had been ordinary in every visible sense, yet the echo of the previous night's rhythm lingered like a shadow beneath his skin, weaving through his thoughts and muscles. Emily waited as usual, her scarf fluttering in the mild breeze, and without a word they walked together across the field, their footsteps synchronized with a quiet, unspoken anticipation. The world around them, trees, grass, the soft hum of the wind, seemed suspended, listening alongside them. They reached the familiar slope and settled on the cool earth, shoulders brushing. The sky above stretched wider than it had any day before, deepening from indigo to a velvety black. Rick's chest throbbed with an eager patience, a readiness to receive whatever message the stars might send. And then, slowly, the rhythm began. 3, steady, 4, deliberate, 5, insistent, 6, soft, 7, fluid, teasing, 8, subtle, yet undeniable. The sequence lingered, each flicker carrying an almost tangible weight, and Rick felt a tremor of recognition deep within. This was more than a pattern. It was a voice, not spoken, but felt, stretching across the quiet night to touch them. Emily's hand found his again, and this time she held it without hesitation, as if anchoring them both to the ground and the sky at once. "Do you feel it?" she whispered. "It's guiding you." Rick nodded, eyes fixed upward. He didn't reach for his notebook. There was nothing to write. The experience could not be captured in symbols. Instead, he let it seep into him, each flicker, each pause, a subtle reshaping of perception. 7 had felt like a leap before, but 8 was different, layered, delicate, yet vast, like a bridge forming between comprehension and feeling. The rhythm was no longer simply an external pattern. It was entwining with him, responding to the shifts in his attention, to the pauses in his own breathing. The wind whispered softly through the grass, carrying faint scents of earth and night flowers. Rick felt the boundaries between himself and the universe blur slightly, as if the star's light was not distant at all, but threading through his veins, infusing him with something tender and strange. Emily's presence beside him was a quiet anchor, a reminder that he was not alone in this vast dialogue. The paradox that had always unsettled him, intimacy in the face of distance, clarity in the midst of mystery, deepened, but it no longer scared him. It fascinated him. After a long stretch of silence, the flickers shifted again, forming a wave rather than a count. Rick realized they were no longer interested in simple sequences. They were teaching him rhythm, attention, presence. He felt the hum of the universe resonating with his own heartbeat, a gentle vibration that spread through his chest and out into the tips of his fingers. Each flicker spoke less of numbers and more of awareness, of noticing without judgment, of feeling without needing to name. Emily leaned her head against his shoulder. "I think it wants you to trust it," she murmured. "To become part of the conversation, not just the listener." Rick closed his eyes, letting her words and the pulse of light merge. Trust. He had watched, he had recorded, he had waited, and now he understood that the stars were asking for more. Participation, surrender, the willingness to exist inside the rhythm rather than outside it. It was a lesson that carried quiet power, reshaping not just his understanding of the universe, but his understanding of himself. The sky finally settled into ordinary twinkle, yet Rick's chest still vibrated with the memory of the night's wave. Walking home, the world seemed both familiar and transformed. Each sound, the rustle of leaves, the distant bark of a dog, the soft whisper of the wind, felt like an echo of what he had experienced, reminders that the universe was alive, with subtleties waiting to be felt. That night, lying in bed, he could not sleep immediately. The rhythm pulsed softly in his mind, weaving through dreams that felt both strange and intimate. In the dream, the flickers moved like threads, drawing him into patterns that were not numbers, not sequences, but expressions, invitations to notice and trust. And when he finally drifted into sleep, it was with the quiet certainty that he was no longer a passive observer, but a participant in something infinite, fragile, and astonishingly alive. The morning light filtered through Rick's curtains in soft, hesitant streaks, but he barely noticed it. Sleep had left him with a lingering hum, the rhythm of the stars vibrating faintly in his chest, like a memory he couldn't release. Breakfast was quiet, his parents speaking in their usual tones, unaware that something within him had shifted, subtly but irreversibly. He moved through the house with measured steps, as if every action had weight, and even the ordinary, the clink of a spoon, the scrape of a chair, seemed to echo with resonance from the night before. At school, Rick carried the hum with him, walking through halls that felt simultaneously familiar and impossibly vast. Emily noticed immediately, her eyes catching his from across the room with a knowing calm. During class, while the teacher spoke of dates and equations, Rick traced invisible patterns in the air with his fingers, the rhythm of the flickers still, guiding his movements. The ordinary sounds, the scratch of chalk, the shuffle of papers, the murmur of students were no longer mundane, but layered with echoes, subtle harmonics of a language only he could sense. When the final bell rang, Rick didn't hesitate. He and Emily walked toward the rise without speaking, the air carrying the faint scent of grass and the lingering warmth of the day. The field stretched wide beneath the settling dusk, shadows lengthening and mingling with the early night. They lay on the cool ground as always, shoulders brushing, hearts tethered to a shared expectation that neither needed to name. Above, the sky spread wide, endless, patient, waiting for them to listen. The rhythm began again, familiar yet different. 3, steady. 4, deliberate. 5, insistent. 6, soft. 7, teasing. 8, fluid. And then a new layer emerged. 9 flickers, each distinct, each bending slightly in tempo and intensity, creating a pattern that felt less like counting and more like melody. Rick's chest tightened with awe, and for the first time he sensed the depth of what the stars were offering. They weren't merely teaching him to notice, they were teaching him to exist within the rhythm, to align himself with it, to feel it as an extension of his own being. Emily's hand found his, grounding him. "It's speaking in more than numbers now," she murmured. "It's emotion, presence. It wants you to notice the pauses, not just the light." Rick closed his eyes, letting the 9 flickers wash over him. Each pulse resonated with his heartbeat, threading through him, bending space into intimacy. He felt simultaneously enormous and small, a paradox that had accompanied every previous night, yet now carried a new clarity. The light was no longer distant. It moved through him, shaping him quietly, tenderly. He realized he was not merely observing, it was teaching him to participate, to attune, to carry presence with patience and care. The flickers finally stilled, leaving only ordinary stars in their wake, yet Rick felt their echo pulse in his chest, insistent and alive. Walking home with Emily, the world seemed subtly transformed. Every sound, the whisper of the wind through the leaves, the distant bark of a dog, the hum of tires on asphalt, carried a faint vibration, reminders that the universe was alive, with nuances waiting to be felt. Rick thought of Emily beside him, realizing that this shared attention, this shared witnessing, had become a lifeline as vital as the stars themselves. That night, in his room, he lay awake longer than usual. The rhythm pulsed softly through his dreams, weaving intricate patterns that felt more like music than light. He reached out in his mind, feeling the tendrils of the flickers wrap around him, drawing him deeper into awareness. Each pulse seemed to whisper a lesson he could not yet name: patience, trust, surrender, presence. When sleep finally claimed him, it was with a gentle, expansive certainty. The world outside his window was ordinary, but inside, the universe and he were slowly learning to exist together, each flicker a note in a song that had only just begun to unfold. The day began with a quiet gravity that Rick could feel in his chest before he even opened his eyes. Light seeped in through the curtains in muted stripes, and he lay still for a moment, listening to the residual pulse of the previous night's rhythm. The 9 flickers still resonated softly, like a song he hadn't yet learned to hum, but could sense in every breath. Breakfast was subdued, the ordinary sounds of his parents' voices blending with the echo of the stars' rhythm. Rick moved carefully through his routine, aware that he carried something fragile and immense, something that demanded presence even in the simplest actions. School was no longer a neutral ground for him. Each sound, each movement carried resonance. The rustle of pages, the faint hum of the air conditioning, the distant laughter in the halls, all of it threaded through him with a strange intensity. Emily noticed instantly, her gaze finding his across the room, calm and knowing. During lessons, she leaned close once, her words soft. "Remember, it's not just counting, it's feeling." He nodded subtly, feeling the truth in her reminder. The flickers were no longer external patterns. They had begun to intertwine with his awareness, shaping perception and thought alike. By late afternoon, he could no longer resist the pull of the field. He and Emily walked together in quiet harmony, the world around them fading into the background, leaving only the rise, the sky, and the space between. They settled onto the familiar cool earth, shoulders brushing, and waited. The evening air carried the faint scent of wildflowers, the wind whispering softly in the grass. Above, the sky stretched vast and infinite, a living canvas that had waited. For them all day, the rhythm began as always: 3, steady; 4, deliberate; 5, insistent; 6, soft; 7, teasing; 8, fluid; 9, melodic. Then something new emerged, subtle at first, almost imperceptible: 10, faint and shimmering, bending gently across the sky. Rick's chest tightened. 10. It was no longer a simple extension of the sequence, but a new dimension, a phrase in a language made of light and silence. He felt it pulse, not just in his eyes, but inside him, a quiet vibration in his chest and fingertips. Emily's hand found his again, grounding him as the unfamiliar rhythm washed over them.
"It's expanding," she whispered, her voice hushed in reverence. "It's inviting you further." Rick closed his eyes, surrendering to the sensation. Each flicker, each subtle shift, carried more than light. It carried presence, attention,
and trust. The paradox he had learned to carry, the intimacy of distance, the clarity of uncertainty, deepened. He understood now that the stars were no longer merely teaching him to observe or to wait. They were shaping him, drawing him into participation, into a rhythm that demanded awareness without grasping, presence without control. The 10 flickers finally stilled, leaving only the ordinary stars twinkling softly, yet their echo remained in Rick's chest, insistent and tender. On the walk home, he noticed the world differently. The rustle of leaves in the wind, the distant hum of a car, the soft murmur of voices from houses along the street. Every ordinary sound carried a subtle vibration, a reminder that the universe pulsed everywhere, and he was now attuned to it. Emily walked beside him, quiet, steady, the presence of another attuned, being a comfort as profound as the stars themselves. That night, Rick lay in bed, letting the rhythm pulse through him, threading, through dreams that felt as much like motion as light. In those dreams, the flickers moved with intent, guiding him, inviting him, teaching him a language that could not be spoken, only felt. He sensed that this journey, the slow unfolding, the careful attention, the delicate trust, was only beginning. And as sleep finally claimed him, he rested in the quiet certainty that he was no longer a passive observer, but an active participant in a living, breathing universe, each flicker a pulse of a rhythm that was slowly becoming his own. The morning came slow, quiet, and heavy with anticipation, though Rick could not name why. The remnants of the previous night's rhythm lingered in his chest like a subtle heartbeat, threading through every movement, every thought. The sunlight spilling across his room seemed unusually soft, muted, as if it, too, had been touched by the flicker's quiet insistence. Breakfast passed without note, the ordinary clinks and murmurs of his family muted in comparison to the echo that vibrated faintly through him. He moved carefully, aware that something inside him had shifted irrevocably, though the world outside remained unchanged. School was a delicate tension, a place of ordinary routines now underlain by extraordinary perception. Each sound, the scrape of a chair, the soft thrum of footsteps in the hall, whispers passing between friends, seemed to carry a resonance he could almost touch. Emily stayed close, her presence an anchor amidst the subtle chaos. She leaned toward him once during class, brushing a strand of hair from her face, and whispered, "You're listening differently now."
"Not just seeing, not just counting." Rick nodded, the words settling like stones in his chest. He understood. The flickers were no longer external. They were entwined with his perception, a rhythm extending through him and shaping the way he existed in the world. By afternoon, the pull of the rise was irresistible.
Rick and Emily walked side by side, the familiar path carrying them into quiet anticipation. The field stretched wide beneath them, the grass soft, carrying the faint scent of the earth and night flowers lingering from earlier days. They settled, on the cool ground, shoulders brushing, hearts synchronized with the unspoken tension of expectation. Above, the sky stretched vast and endless, waiting patiently as if the universe itself held its breath. The rhythm began, familiar yet evolving. 3 steady, 4 deliberate, 5 insistent, 6 soft, 7 teasing, 8 fluid, 9 melodic, 10 shimmering, and then, unexpectedly, 11, subtle and tentative, flickered into existence. Rick's chest tightened, a combination of awe and quiet, fear threading through him. 11 was different. It carried presence, attention, and intention all at once. The flickers were no longer merely sequences. They were expressions, lessons in patience and perception, invitations to participate. Without grasping, Emily's hand found his, grounding him as the light pulsed in complex waves above. "It's asking more," she whispered. "Not for understanding, not yet, but for presence, trust." Rick closed his eyes and let the rhythm wash through him. Each flicker, each pause, each subtle shift carried a resonance beyond comprehension, threading through his chest and out to the tips of his fingers. The paradox that had accompanied him since the earliest flickers, the intimacy of distance, the clarity within uncertainty, deepened but no longer unsettled him. Instead, it expanded him, drawing him into participation, teaching him to inhabit the rhythm rather than observe it. When the 11 flickers finally stilled, leaving only ordinary stars twinkling faintly, Rick felt the echo linger within him, insistent and tender. Walking home with Emily, the world seemed transformed. The rustle of leaves, the distant hum of tires, the soft murmur of conversations, all carried subtle vibrations, reminders that the universe pulsed everywhere, and he was attuned to it. Emily walked beside him, quiet and steady, the comfort of shared awareness as profound as the stars themselves. That night, lying in bed, Rick felt the rhythm pulse softly in his dreams, threading patterns of light and motion that were less numbers than melodies, less sequences than invitations. He sensed the journey stretching forward, a delicate unfolding requiring attention, trust, and surrender. Sleep came slowly, yet with it came clarity. He was no longer a passive observer. Each flicker, each pause, each wave of light was now part of his own living rhythm, teaching him how to exist in harmony with the universe's subtle, infinite pulse. The morning sun was gentle, diffused through thin clouds, yet Rick felt the weight of expectation in its quiet warmth. The 11 flickers from last night lingered in his chest like a soft hum, a constant pulse threading through his limbs and thoughts. Breakfast passed in near silence. His parents moved through routine, unaware of the vast rhythm now residing in him. Rick felt changed, not visibly, not in the way one could point to, but in every subtle motion, every pause between breaths. The world seemed both ordinary and impossibly alive, each sound, each shadow, each flicker of movement carrying layers he could feel but not yet name. At school, the ordinary routines seemed slightly displaced. The scrape of chairs, the soft murmur of conversations, the shuffle of papers across desks, all resonated with an intensity Rick had never experienced before. Emily was beside him as always, quiet but attentive, her presence a tether grounding him amidst the unseen currents. During class, she leaned toward him and whispered, "It's teaching you patience now. Not for mastery, not for counting, but for awareness. Can you feel it?" Rick nodded subtly, feeling the truth of her words echo through him. The rhythm of the stars was no longer external. It had merged with his perception, altering how he experienced time, sound, and presence. By late afternoon, the field called, to him with irresistible insistence. Rick and Emily walked side by side along the familiar path, the soft grass beneath their feet releasing the faint scent of earth and flowers. They reached the rise and settled onto the cool earth, shoulders brushing, hearts synchronized in anticipation. The sky above stretched wide and infinite, a silent audience waiting for the next unfolding. The rhythm began as it had before: 3, steady; 4, deliberate; 5, insistent; 6, soft; 7, teasing; 8, fluid; 9, melodic; 10, shimmering; 11, tentative; and then, for the first time, 12 flickers appeared, subtle yet undeniable, bending and folding in a way that felt almost like language. Rick felt the pulse in his chest deepen, a quiet expansion spreading through his lungs and fingers. The rhythm was no longer just teaching him to notice, it was inviting him to participate fully, to exist within it, to become attuned to its gentle, infinite flow. Emily's hand found his, grounding him as the 12 flickers moved with a fluidity he had never experienced. "It's asking more now," she whispered, reverent and calm. Not understanding, not recording, just presence, trust, feel it. Rick closed his eyes, surrendering to the motion of the light. Each flicker, each pause, each subtle wave threaded through him, shaping him without words. The paradox that had followed him since the earliest flickers, the intimacy in distance, clarity within uncertainty, deepened into a quiet awe. He was learning to inhabit the rhythm rather than observe it, to carry the presence within him, to breathe in harmony with the pulse of the stars. When the flickers finally stilled, leaving only ordinary stars twinkling quietly, Rick felt their echo persist, gentle yet insistent. Walking home with Emily, the world seemed subtly transformed. The rustle of leaves, the distant hum of a car, the faint murmur of voices, all carried the vibrations of the unseen, reminders that the universe pulsed everywhere and he was attuned. Emily's quiet companionship reinforced this awareness, a shared understanding that was as comforting as the rhythm itself. That night, lying in bed, Rick felt the 12 flickers pulse softly in his dreams, weaving patterns of light and motion that were less sequences than melodies, less numbers than invitations. He realized the journey was slowly unfolding, each night, each flicker, each pause a lesson in patience, trust, and surrender. And as sleep claimed him, he felt a gentle certainty. He was no longer a passive observer. Each pulse of light, each quiet wave, was now part of his own living rhythm, guiding him toward a presence both infinite and intimately his own. The day began with a soft hush, a kind of stillness that pressed gently against Rick's awareness. The 12 flickers from the previous night had settled into him like a quiet pulse, threading through his movements and thoughts without disruption, a rhythm that felt simultaneously external and part of himself. Breakfast passed in muted tones, the clinks of utensils and faint murmur of conversation carrying a resonance he could almost touch. He moved through the house with care, each step, each gesture, conscious of the subtle rhythm flowing inside him. The ordinary world seemed richer somehow, alive with vibrations he had never noticed before, each breath and sound layered with meaning. School was no longer just a place of routine. Every sound, the scrape of a chair, the whisper of pages turning, the hum of distant conversation, vibrated faintly in tandem with the rhythm within him. Emily stayed close as always, her presence grounding him, her eyes quietly attentive. At one point during class, She leaned toward him and murmured, "It's asking for something more. Not mastery, not understanding, just presence. Are you listening?" Rick's lips curved in a subtle acknowledgement. He felt the truth of her. Words resonate with the pulse in his chest. The flickers were no longer external curiosities. They were now an intimate language, intertwining with perception and shaping how he existed in every moment. By late afternoon, he could no longer resist the field. He and Emily walked along the familiar path, grass soft underfoot and carrying the faint scent of earth and lingering blooms. They reached the rise and settled onto the cool ground, shoulders brushing, hearts aligned with unspoken anticipation. The sky stretched wide above, infinite, patient, waiting for the next lesson. The rhythm began, familiar yet evolving. 3, steady. 4, deliberate. 5, insistent. 6, soft. 7, teasing. 8, fluid. 9, melodic. 10, shimmering. 11, tentative. 12, flowing. Then, as if the universe itself had decided to speak directly, 13 appeared, a gentle, lingering flicker that moved slowly, almost caressing the edges of perception. Rick's chest tightened with awe. 13 was different. It carried nuance, depth, and a strange intimacy, a subtle invitation to merge observation with being, to feel rather than interpret. Emily's hand found his, grounding him as the 13 flickers pulsed above. "It's asking you to surrender now," she whispered, reverent and calm. Not to control, not to measure, just to exist inside it. Trust it. Rick closed his eyes, letting the motion of light and pause thread through him, shaping him silently. The paradox that had been his companion, the intimacy in distance, the clarity within uncertainty, deepened into quiet awe. He was learning not to inhabit the world as an observer, but to live within the rhythm, to carry presence as naturally as breath, to move in tandem with the subtle currents that pulsed through all things. When the flickers finally stilled, leaving only ordinary stars blinking faintly in the night, Rick felt their echo linger in his chest, soft but insistent. The walk home with Emily was slow and deliberate. Every ordinary sound, the rustle of leaves, the faint hum of a passing car, distant voices, carried vibrations that reminded him the universe pulsed everywhere, and he was attuned. Emily's quiet companionship reinforced the lesson, a shared awareness that felt as profound as the stars themselves. That night, lying in bed, Rick felt the 13 flickers pulse softly through his dreams, weaving intricate patterns of motion and light that were less numbers than melodies, less sequences than invitations. He realized the journey was expanding, a slow, careful unfolding that demanded attention, trust, and surrender. Sleep finally claimed him, but with it came the gentle certainty that he was no longer a passive observer. Each flicker, each wave, each quiet pulse had become part of his own living rhythm, guiding him toward a presence that was at once infinite, intimate, and entirely his own. The morning arrived in muted golds and soft shadows, the light spilling across Rick's room and in quiet, hesitant beams. The 13 flickers from last night had settled into him like a slow, persistent heartbeat, threading through his thoughts and movements with gentle insistence. Breakfast passed in calm, muted tones, the clinks of utensils and the hum of conversation, resonating faintly in his chest, carrying echoes of the rhythm that now felt inseparable from him. He moved with care, each step and gesture conscious of the subtle vibration that pulsed within, noticing how even the smallest action carried layers he had never perceived before. School felt simultaneously ordinary and alive, each sound carrying weight he could feel. The scrape of a chair across linoleum, the shuffle of papers, the soft murmur of voices drifting down the hall. Emily remained close, a steady presence, her quiet attention grounding him in the subtle chaos of heightened perception. At one point, leaning toward him during class, she whispered, "It's asking for surrender now. Not to understand, not to measure, just to feel." Rick nodded softly, letting her words echo within him. The flickers were no longer external. Curiosities, they had become an intimate language, shaping the way he perceived every motion, every breath, every pause. By late afternoon, he could no longer resist the pull of the rise. He and Emily walked side by side along the familiar path, the grass beneath their feet, soft and fragrant, carrying faint traces of earth and lingering blooms. They settled on the cool earth at the top, shoulders brushing, hearts synchronized with the unspoken anticipation. The sky above stretched vast and patient, a living canvas waiting for the next lesson, infinite yet intimately near. The rhythm began as always: 3, steady; 4, deliberate; 5, insistent; 6, soft; 7, teasing; 8, fluid; 9, melodic; 10, shimmering; 11, tentative; 12, flowing; 13, lingering. And then, as if opening a new chapter of its own, 14 flickers appeared, delicate, subtle, moving in a slow, almost conversational pattern that bent the previous rhythms into something richer, more nuanced. Rick's chest tightened with awe. 14 felt alive, intentional, an expression rather than a pattern, a pulse that demanded immersion instead of observation. Emily's hand found his, warm and steady, grounding him as the 14 flickers moved above. "It's inviting you further now," she whispered. "Not to control, not to interpret. Just to exist inside it, to trust it completely." Rick closed his eyes, surrendering to the motion of light and pause threading through him, shaping him silently, invisibly. The paradox that had accompanied him since the earliest flickers, the intimacy in distance, the clarity within uncertainty, deepened into quiet reverence. He was learning not merely to inhabit the world as an observer, but to live inside the rhythm itself, to carry presence as naturally as breath, to align with the subtle currents that pulsed through all things. When the flickers finally stilled, leaving only ordinary stars twinkling faintly, Rick felt the echo remain, insistent yet tender, resonating softly in his chest. Walking home with Emily, the world seemed transformed. The rustle of leaves, the distant hum of a passing car, the faint murmur of voices, all vibrated with subtle pulses, reminders that the universe was alive everywhere, and he was now attuned to it. Emily's quiet presence beside him reinforced this understanding, a shared awareness as profound as the rhythm itself. That night, lying in bed, Rick felt the 14 flickers pulse softly through his dreams, weaving intricate patterns of light and motion that were less sequences than melodies, less numbers than invitations. The journey was expanding, unfolding slowly and deliberately, each night, each flicker, each pause a lesson in patience, trust, and surrender. Sleep claimed him, gently, but with it came clarity. He was no longer a passive observer. Each flicker, each quiet wave, each tender pulse had become part of his living rhythm, guiding him toward a presence that was infinite, intimate, and fully his own. The dawn was gentle, spilling soft light across Rick's room in delicate, golden streaks. He woke with the faint echo of the 14 flickers lingering in his chest, a rhythm that felt like it had settled into him permanently, subtle yet insistent.
Breakfast passed quietly.
The mundane clinks of utensils and murmurs of conversation seemed amplified with meaning now, as if each sound carried its own pulse, its own small lesson. Rick moved deliberately, aware of the gentle vibration threading through his limbs and thoughts, a quiet reminder that the ordinary world had shifted. Everything felt alive in ways he could not yet fully name. School held its familiar rhythms, yet each ordinary noise, the scrape of chairs, the hum of ventilation, the shuffle of pages, resonated with a layered intensity that drew his full attention. Emily remained beside him, steady and calm, her eyes reflecting understanding. At one point, she leaned close and whispered, "It's no longer about noticing. It's about feeling it, letting it move through you." Rick's lips curved in a small, knowing smile. She was right. The flickers had become a living language, a pulse interwoven with perception, shaping not only what he saw, but how he existed in every moment. By afternoon, the pull of the rise became irresistible. He and Emily walked in silence along the familiar path, the soft grass underfoot, carrying traces of earth and blooms lingering from earlier days. Reaching the top, they settled onto the cool earth, shoulders brushing, hearts aligned in quiet expectation. The sky above was vast and patient, an infinite expanse that seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next lesson to unfold. The rhythm began once more. 3, steady; 4, deliberate; 5, insistent; 6, soft; 7, teasing; 8, fluid; 9, melodic; 10, shimmering; 11, tentative; 12, flowing; 13, lingering; 14, subtle and deliberate. And then, for the first time, 15 flickers emerged, faint but undeniable, moving in gentle, almost intimate waves that seemed to stretch and bend the previous rhythms into a new form. Rick's chest tightened in awe. 15 was different. It carried a nuance that was no longer simply pattern or sequence. It was a pulse, a gentle dialogue that invited immersion rather than observation, trust rather than understanding. Emily's hand found his, steadying him as the 15 flickers pulsed above, casting soft, fluid light across their faces. "It's asking you to let go now," she whispered. "Not to control, not to measure, just to exist inside it. Trust it fully." Rick closed his eyes, surrendering to the subtle motion of light and pause threading through him. The paradox that had accompanied him for so many nights, the intimacy in distance, clarity within uncertainty, deepened into reverent awe. He was learning not just to inhabit the world as an observer, but to live inside the rhythm itself, carrying presence as naturally as breath, moving with the subtle currents that pulsed through everything. When the flickers finally stilled, leaving only ordinary stars twinkling faintly, Rick felt their echo remain, soft and persistent, resonating in his chest. The walk home with Emily was unhurried. Every ordinary sound, the rustle of leaves, the hum of a distant car, the faint voices drifting from houses, vibrated with subtle pulses, reminders that the universe was alive everywhere, and he was now attuned. Emily's quiet presence beside him reinforced the understanding, a shared awareness as profound as the rhythm itself. That night, lying in bed, Rick felt the 15 flickers pulse softly through his dreams, weaving intricate patterns of light and motion that were less numbers than melodies, less sequences than invitations. The journey was unfolding deliberately each night, each flicker, each pause a lesson in patience, trust, and surrender. Sleep claimed him gently, yet with it came the quiet certainty that he was no longer a passive observer. Each flicker, each tender pulse, Each soft wave had become part of his living rhythm, guiding him toward a presence that was infinite, intimate, and entirely his own. The morning arrived with a tender hush, the sun spilling light across Rick's room in faint, golden streams that felt almost liquid. The 15 flickers from the previous night had nestled deeper into him, a rhythm now inseparable from his own heartbeat, flowing through every thought and motion. Breakfast passed quietly, each clink of utensils and whisper of conversation, carrying a resonance he could feel in the subtle rise and fall of his chest. He moved deliberately, aware that every action, every pause, held a weight and an echo of the rhythm, a reminder that the world had shifted, quietly but profoundly. Around him, school seemed at once ordinary and profoundly alive. Each small noise, the shuffle of papers, the faint scrape of a chair, the distant hum of voices, vibrated in harmony with the rhythm inside him. Emily stayed close, her presence steady and grounding, her eyes reflecting calm understanding. At one point during class, she leaned toward him and whispered softly, "It's no longer about noticing patterns.
It's about surrendering to the flow. Let it move through you." Rick's lips curved in a small, knowing smile. The flickers were no longer external curiosities. They had become an intimate language, a pulse interwoven with perception, shaping
Not only what he saw, but how he lived in every moment. By late afternoon, the field called to him as it always did, an irresistible pull that neither he nor Emily resisted. Walking side by side, the soft grass beneath their feet releasing the faint scent of earth and lingering blooms, they reached the rise and settled on the cool ground. Shoulders brushed, hearts in quiet sync, they gazed at the vast sky above, patient and infinite, waiting for the next unfolding. The rhythm began: 3, steady; 4, deliberate; 5, insistent; 6, soft; 7, teasing; 8, fluid; 9, melodic; 10, shimmering; 11, tentative; 12, flowing; 13, lingering; 14, subtle; 15, deliberate. Then, for the first time, 16 flickers appeared, faint yet undeniable, moving in soft, wave-like motions that stretched the previous patterns into a new depth, bending them into something richer, more layered. Rick's chest tightened with awe. 16 carried nuance beyond simple sequence, a quiet dialogue, a gentle invitation to inhabit the rhythm fully, to merge awareness with presence, to trust without needing to understand. Emily's hand found his, grounding him as the 16 flickers pulsed above, their gentle light casting delicate shadows across their faces. "It wants you to surrender completely now," she murmured. Not to control, not to measure, but simply to exist inside it, to trust it fully. Rick closed his eyes, letting the motion of light and pause thread through him, shaping him quietly and intimately. The paradox that had accompanied him for so many nights, the intimacy in distance, clarity within uncertainty, deepened into reverent awe. He was no longer just inhabiting the world as an observer, he was learning to live inside the rhythm itself, carrying presence naturally, moving with the subtle currents pulsing through all things. When the flickers finally stilled, leaving only ordinary stars blinking faintly in the vast sky, Rick felt their echo persist, insistent and tender, resonating softly in his chest. Walking home with Emily, the world seemed subtly transformed. Every ordinary sound, the rustle of leaves in the wind, the distant hum of a passing car, the soft murmur of distant voices, vibrated with subtle pulses, reminders that the universe was alive everywhere, and he was attuned. Emily's quiet companionship beside him reinforced this understanding, a shared awareness as profound and reassuring as the rhythm itself. That night, lying in bed, Rick felt the 16 flickers pulse gently through his dreams, weaving intricate patterns of light and motion that were less sequences than melodies, less numbers than invitations. He realized the journey was expanding deliberately each night, each flicker, each pause a careful lesson in patience, trust, and surrender. Sleep claimed him softly, and with it came the quiet certainty that he was no longer a passive observer. Each flicker, each tender pulse, each wave of subtle light had become part of his own living rhythm, guiding him toward a presence that was infinite, intimate, and entirely his own. The morning arrived like a whispered promise, soft light filtering through Rick's curtains in a slow, honeyed glow. The 16 flickers from the previous night had embedded themselves deeper, threading through him like an invisible rhythm he carried effortlessly in every breath, every gesture. Breakfast was quiet, the familiar sounds of utensils clinking and voices murmuring beneath his awareness, yet each note vibrated faintly in tandem with the pulse within him. Even the mundane carried resonance now, every step across the floor, every subtle movement echoing the rhythm of something larger, unspoken and tenderly alive. At school, the ordinary sounds, papers shuffling, chairs scraping, whispers flowing between students, felt layered, resonating through Rick in ways that were both subtle and profound. Emily remained close, her calm presence steadying him, a quiet anchor amid the soft current of awareness that now coursed through his body. Leaning slightly, she whispered during class, "It's not about understanding yet. It's about feeling it, letting it shape you without trying to grasp it." Rick's chest tightened with acknowledgement. She was right. The flickers had become a language of presence, woven directly into perception, shaping not what he saw, but how he existed within every heartbeat, every breath, every glance. By late afternoon, he and Emily found themselves drawn to the rise. Once more, walking along the soft grass, the faint scent of earth and lingering blooms filling the air, they settled together atop the cool ground, shoulders brushing, hearts in quiet synchronization. The sky above stretched infinitely, patient and still, waiting for the next unfolding, a silent observer of the rhythm they had begun to inhabit fully. The pattern started as it always did: 3, steady; 4, deliberate; 5, insistent; 6, soft; 7, teasing; 8, fluid; 9, melodic; 10, shimmering; 11, tentative; 12, flowing; 13, lingering; 14, subtle; 15, deliberate; 16, deepening. And then, for the first time, 17 flickers appeared. Faint, almost shy, they moved in delicate waves, folding and bending the earlier sequences into something richer, almost conversational. Rick felt the pulse in his chest expand, subtle at first, then spreading through his lungs, fingertips, and the tips of his hair. 17 was different. It carried intention, a gentle invitation to merge completely with the rhythm, to exist, not as observer, not as participant, but as part of the pulse itself. Emily's hand found his, grounding him, her presence calm and unwavering as the 17 flickers moved above. "It's asking you to surrender fully now," she whispered, "not to measure, not to understand, just to exist inside it. Trust completely." Rick closed his eyes and let the soft motion of light and pause thread through him. The paradox that had accompanied him, the intimacy in distance, clarity within uncertainty, deepened into reverent awe. He was no longer inhabiting the world as a passive observer. He was learning to live inside the rhythm itself, to carry presence as naturally as breathing, to align with the currents that pulsed through every facet of life. When the flickers finally stilled, leaving only ordinary stars twinkling faintly above, Rick felt the echo linger, soft but insistent, in his chest. The walk home with Emily was unhurried, deliberate. Every sound, the rustle of leaves, the hum of a passing car, the faint murmur of voices, carried the faint pulse of the universe, a reminder that life itself was alive, and he was now attuned to it. Emily's quiet companionship beside him reinforced this understanding, a shared awareness as comforting and profound as the rhythm itself. That night, lying in bed, Rick felt the 17 flickers pulse softly through his dreams, weaving intricate patterns of light and motion that were less numbers than melodies, less sequences than invitations. The journey was expanding, unfolding deliberately, each night, each flicker, each pause a lesson in patience, trust, and surrender. Sleep claimed him gently, and with it came the quiet certainty that he was no longer a passive observer. Each flicker, each tender pulse, each subtle wave had become part of his living rhythm, guiding him toward a presence that was infinite, intimate, and entirely his own. The morning light seeped softly through Rick's window, painting his room in gentle golds and pale ambers. The 17 flickers from the previous night lingered within him, a quiet rhythm threading through his chest, his arms, his legs, as
natural as his own heartbeat. Breakfast passed in calm, deliberate silence. The familiar sounds of spoons tapping against bowls and the murmur of conversation seemed to carry layers of resonance he had never noticed before.
every small movement, the stretch of his arms, the brush of his fingers across the table, felt like part of an unbroken, delicate pulse, a reminder that the world itself had grown tenderly alive around him. At school, the ordinary sounds of the day, papers shuffling, chairs scraping, low murmurs of voices, resonated in tandem with the pulse inside him. Emily stayed close, her presence a steady, grounding force, her gaze calm, almost knowing. During class, she leaned slightly toward him and whispered softly, "It's asking you to feel beyond sight and sound, not to understand, just to let it move through you." Rick's lips curved in a faint smile, a subtle acknowledgement. She was right. The flickers were no longer mere phenomena. They had become a language of presence, interwoven with perception, shaping not only what he experienced, but how he existed in every quiet moment. By the late afternoon, the field called again, the soft pull irresistible. He and Emily walked along the familiar path, the grass beneath their feet, carrying faint scents of earth and the lingering perfume of flowers. Atop the rise, they settled onto the cool ground, shoulders brushing, hearts aligned in quiet anticipation. The sky above stretched endlessly, patient and vast, a silent witness to the unfolding rhythm, as if holding its breath, waiting for the next lesson to reveal itself. The familiar rhythm began. 3, steady. 4, deliberate. 5, insistent. 6, soft. 7, teasing. 8, fluid. 9, melodic. 10, shimmering. 11, tentative. 12, flowing. 13, lingering. 14, subtle. 15, deliberate. 16, deepening. 17, resonant. And then, for the first time, 18 flickers appeared, delicate yet insistent, moving in slow, intertwining waves that folded the previous patterns into something richer, more expressive. Rick's chest tightened in quiet awe. 18 felt alive in a new way, intentional and intimate, inviting him to merge fully with the rhythm, to surrender his perception and exist within its motion rather than merely alongside it. Emily's
Hand found his, steady and warm, grounding him as the 18 flickers shimmered above them. "It wants complete trust now," she whispered.
Not to measure, not to control, just to be fully and entirely inside it. Rick closed his eyes, letting the movement of light and pause thread through him, shaping him in quiet, invisible ways. The paradox that had followed him for nights, the intimacy in distance, the clarity within uncertainty, deepened into a reverent awe. He was no longer inhabiting the world as an observer. He was learning to live inside the rhythm itself, to carry presence as naturally as breathing, to align with the subtle currents pulsing through everything around him. When the flickers stilled, leaving only ordinary stars twinkling softly above, Rick felt their echo linger, gentle yet persistent, resonating quietly in his chest. Walking home with Emily, the ordinary world seemed subtly transformed. The rustle of leaves, the distant hum of passing cars, faint voices drifting through the night, all carried the soft, invisible pulse of life, reminders that the universe was alive everywhere, and he was attuned. Emily's quiet presence beside him reinforced the understanding, a shared awareness as comforting and profound as the rhythm itself. That night, lying in bed, Rick felt the 18 flickers pulse softly. Through his dreams, weaving patterns of light and motion that were less sequences than melodies, less numbers than invitations. The journey was unfolding deliberately each night, each flicker, each pause, a lesson in patience, trust, and surrender. Sleep claimed him gently, and with it came the quiet certainty that he was no longer a passive observer. Each flicker, each tender pulse, each subtle wave had become part of his living rhythm, guiding him toward a presence that was infinite, intimate, and entirely his own. The first light of morning stretched across Rick's room in muted golds, spilling through the curtains in soft, hesitant streams. The 18 flickers from the previous night rested lightly within him, a quiet rhythm threading through his chest, limbs, and thoughts, as natural and persistent as his own heartbeat. Breakfast passed in gentle, deliberate calm. The familiar clinks of spoons and murmurs of conversation resonated with the pulse inside him, each ordinary sound carrying layers of meaning that he had only begun to perceive. Every movement, every gesture, no matter how small, felt imbued with an invisible current, a quiet invitation to exist fully, deliberately, and tenderly. School held its familiar cadence, yet the ordinary noises, the scrape of a chair, the shuffle of papers, the low hum of distant conversations, vibrated softly in tandem with the rhythm inside him. Emily stayed close, her presence steady and grounding, her gaze reflecting quiet understanding. Leaning toward him during class, she whispered softly, "It's not about noticing anymore, it's about being. Let it flow through you, unmeasured,
unguarded." Rick's lips curved into a small, reverent smile. The flickers were no longer just external phenomena, they had become a language of presence, interwoven with perception, shaping not just what he observed, but how he existed in.
Each heartbeat, each breath, each fleeting glance. By afternoon, the pull of the field was irresistible. He and Emily walked along the soft, familiar path, the grass releasing faint scents of earth and lingering blooms with each step. Atop the rise, they settled onto the cool ground, shoulders brushing, hearts aligned in quiet anticipation. The dark sky above stretched infinite and patient, a silent witness to the unfolding rhythm, as if it held its breath, waiting for the next chapter to reveal itself. The rhythm began once more. 3, steady. 4, deliberate. 5, insistent. 6, soft, 7 teasing, 8 fluid, 9 melodic, 10 shimmering, 11 tentative, 12 flowing, 13 lingering, 14 subtle, 15 deliberate, 16 deepening, 17 resonant, 18 pulsating. And then, for the first time, 19 flickers appeared, delicate yet insistent, moving in soft, intertwining waves that folded and stretched the previous patterns into something richer, more expressive. Rick's chest tightened with awe. 19 was different. It carried subtle intention, a gentle invitation to merge fully with the rhythm, to dissolve the distinction between observer and movement, between presence and pulse. Emily's hand found his, grounding him, warm and steady, as the 19 flickers shimmered above them, casting soft, fluid light across their faces. "It's asking for complete surrender," she murmured. Not to measure, not to control, just to be fully inside it. Trust entirely. Rick closed his eyes, letting the motion of light and pause thread through him, shaping him quietly, invisibly. The paradox that had followed him, the intimacy in distance, clarity within uncertainty, deepened into quiet, reverent awe. He was no longer a passive observer in the world. He was learning to inhabit the rhythm itself, to carry presence as naturally as breathing, to align with the subtle currents pulsing through all things around him. When the flickers finally stilled, leaving only ordinary stars blinking faintly in the night sky, Rick felt their echo linger, gentle but persistent, resonating softly in his chest. The walk home with Emily was deliberate and unhurried. Every sound, the rustle of leaves, the distant hum of a passing car, faint voices drifting from homes, vibrated with subtle pulses, reminders that the universe was alive everywhere, and he was attuned. Emily's quiet presence beside him reinforced the understanding, a shared awareness as comforting and profound as the rhythm itself. That night, lying in bed, Rick felt the 19 flickers pulse softly through his dreams, weaving intricate patterns of light and motion that were less sequences than melodies, less numbers than invitations. The journey was expanding deliberately. Each night, each flicker, each pause a lesson in patience, trust, and surrender. Sleep claimed him gently, and with it came the quiet certainty that he was no longer a passive observer. Each flicker, each tender pulse, each subtle wave had become part of his living rhythm, guiding him toward a presence that was infinite, intimate, and entirely his own. The morning light crept softly through Rick's window, spilling gold and amber across his room.
Gentle and unhurried,
The 19 flickers from the previous night lingered still, a quiet rhythm threading through his chest and limbs, as familiar and unforced as his own breathing. Breakfast passed in calm, deliberate motions, the soft clinks of utensils, and muted. Conversation felt almost musical, each note resonating in sync with the pulse inside him. Every small gesture, the stretch of his arms, the brush of his fingers against the table, the subtle incline of his head, carried a sense of unspoken intention, a reminder that the world around him had grown quietly alive, tender, and deeply patient. School felt both ordinary and luminous. The familiar hum of voices, the shuffle of papers, the scrape of chairs, all carried a soft resonance that he could feel threading through every cell of his body. Emily walked beside him, her presence steady, calm, and deeply reassuring. She leaned close at one point and whispered, "It's beyond noticing now. It's about being inside it, letting it move through you, shaping your presence without words." Rick nodded, lips curving into a small, reverent smile. The flickers had transformed into a language, one of presence and intimacy, weaving him not merely into observation, but into existence itself, threading awareness through each heartbeat, each inhalation, each soft glance. By late afternoon, the field drew him once again, the pull irresistible. He and Emily walked along the familiar path, the soft grass beneath them carrying faint scents of earth and blooms. Settling at the top of the rise, shoulders brushing, hearts aligned in quiet anticipation, they gazed at the infinite sky. The rhythm began with its familiar sequence. 3, steady. 4, deliberate. 5, insistent. 6, soft. 7, teasing. 8, fluid. 9, melodic. 10, shimmering. 11, tentative. 12, flowing. 13, lingering. 14, subtle. 15, deliberate. 16, deepening. 17, resonant. 18, pulsating. 19, attentive. And then, for the first time, 20 flickers emerged, soft, deliberate, moving in gentle, intertwining waves that stretched the previous sequences into a depth that was at once delicate and commanding. Rick's chest tightened in awe. 20 was not just an extension, it carried a tender insistence, a quiet invitation to surrender fully, to merge entirely with the rhythm rather than merely inhabit it. Emily's hand found his, warm and steady, grounding him as the 20 flickers shimmered and danced above them. "It wants you to be fully present," she whispered, "not to control, not to measure, not to understand, just to exist inside it, completely and entirely." Rick closed his eyes, letting the movement thread through him, shaping him silently, invisibly, as he breathed in sync with the pulses. The paradox that had traveled with him, the intimacy in distance, the clarity within uncertainty, deepened into quiet, reverent awe. He was no longer a mere observer. He was learning to inhabit the rhythm itself, to carry presence as effortlessly as breathing, to align with the subtle currents of life that pulsed through every motion, every pause, every living thing around him. When the flickers stilled, leaving only ordinary stars blinking faintly in the evening sky, Rick felt their echo remain, soft but insistent, resonating gently in his chest. The walk home with Emily was unhurried, each step deliberate, each sound of rustling leaves, distant cars, and faint voices vibrating with subtle pulses that reminded him life was alive everywhere, and he was attuned. Emily's quiet presence beside him reinforced this understanding, a shared awareness as comforting and profound as the rhythm itself. That night, lying in bed, Rick felt the 20 flickers pulse softly through his dreams, weaving patterns of light and motion that were less numbers than melodies, less sequences than invitations. The journey had reached a quiet fullness, each night, each flicker, each pause a deliberate lesson in patience, trust, and surrender. Sleep claimed him gently, and with it came a deep certainty. He was no longer a passive observer. Each flicker, each tender pulse, each wave of light had become part of his living rhythm, guiding him toward a presence infinite, intimate, and entirely his own. And somewhere, in the quiet of the universe, he stretched into the stars, finally.
At peace. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, man. The end.